Demon-Kissed, Part 5, Merrick, Chapter 20. A Letter to Aaron. Is this feeling that I have for you real or imagined? I know not, but I know it is strong, and wonder if you feel it too. Tell me, love, do you love me too? Could you love a fae who has nothing to give you but his battered heart? Merrick Whiteford. Wait, what about Merrick? Isn't he human? I heard Aaron ask through the door as I raised my hand to knock, and froze. Alistair had asked me to retrieve Dom from his visit with her, as he was needed for a discussion, and Lucian had left the second I had arrived up here to do so. I had no idea as to how my name had come up in their conversation, and I didn't truly care at the moment. All I cared about was whether or not Dom would have the sense to lie to her and keep what I was secret for now. The silence on the other side of the door stretched for several moments, and I knocked. Whether Dom had told her anything about me or not, I hadn't a clue, and at the moment I didn't have time to care. I needed to collect him and get our asses back downstairs so that Alistair could talk to both of us. Why Alistair wasn't up here with them was puzzling, because I had heard him say last night that he'd introduce them today. But I supposed that he had been either out or busy when Dom arrived. A few minutes ago, when he asked me to come up here and get Dom, Alistair had seemed a little distracted and aggravated. I had felt Dom the instant he entered the property, and hadn't thought much about it. But perhaps I should have told Alistair he was here 2 hours ago when he arrived, rather than just telling Lucian. The door opened to reveal Dom, and he looked relieved to see me. Or maybe he would have been happy to see anyone at the moment, because when I looked past him into the room, Erin was glaring at his back and reaching for something under the blanket on her lap. "If you shoot me, Aaron, for not answering one question that is not mine to answer, I will not be very pleased, and will refuse to answer any questions you may have in the future," he said without turning to look at her, and she froze with her hands still under the blanket. "Good to see you in one piece again, Merrick," he added, and gave me a genuine friendly smile that I returned. If I had the choice 4 months ago when I was injured, I would have preferred to recover in his home rather than here. "Good to be in one piece again, Dominic. Alistair sent me up to get you. If you're done with your visit now," I said, stepping back from the open door, and narrowed my eyes when I saw him wince a bit and reach up to rub his left temple. "By all means, my friend, lead the way," he said, nodding and holding out a hand toward the bedside table, and a black fedora flew across the room to land in his hand. Stepping out of the room, he said over his shoulder, "I shall return tomorrow, my lady. Good night," and shut the door. "You still like to live your life dangerously, I see," I commented as we started down the stairs, and he chuckled. "I was not in any danger from her, Merrick. Even if she had the gun loaded with silver, all her shooting me would have accomplished is pissing me off and ruining a perfectly good coat and shirt," he said, then stopped me in the foyer with a hand on my arm when we left the stairs, and continued in a nearly silent voice. "There is much I need to talk to you about, and some of it needs to be said where no one else might overhear it." I looked at him for a moment, then nodded and waved a hand for him to continue down the hall toward Alistair's office before asking, "Is the job in your club still available, or did you find someone to fill the position?" "The manager's spot?" he asked, glancing at me, and I nodded. "No, at least no one permanent. Why? Are you interested in taking the job?" "Managing your club would be much like the job I had in the Seelie Court, only with fewer complaints and less drama. Paperwork and I are old acquaintances, and I would enjoy being able to work with you and the girls," I said, then grinned and added, "though I suppose it would be working for you and with the girls." "I keep wondering why you never went back home after Ilea passed. Do not misunderstand. I appreciate all that you have done for the guild and family she built. Hells, all of us do. But even Cade, Rosalind, and Rosalind go back to Fairy from time to visit," he said, and I stopped walking. Dom stopped too and turned to look at me quizzically. "There is no one for me to return there to visit, and life as the inter-court messenger had never been my calling. If you would rather find someone else to manage fantasy, I understand, and will look for a similar position at another club. But, Dom, understand this. My reasons for staying are my own, and perhaps one day I will share them with you over some fairy wine. Until that day comes, however, I would appreciate it if you would not question my presence here on this side," I said quietly, looking him straight in the eyes, and noted the surprise there. "The job is yours, if you want it, Merrick. I had not meant to offend you with my observation," he said after a moment, shaking his head, and I smiled a little. "I took no offense, Dominic, truly, and I thank you for the job," I said, and clapped him on the shoulder. "We have a strategy meeting to attend, which will probably take most of the night," he said, turning to continue down the hall, adding, "'Tis not wise to keep Alistair waiting, and I would like to visit with my children before I leave in the morning." "I think the meeting will take longer than you are expecting, and most of the children are spread out over the city gathering information," I said, and he sighed. "Would you consider coming to live with me?" he asked as we reached the open door to Alistair's office. "Give me until tomorrow to think on it?" I asked in return, and he nodded. "Good of you two to finally join us," Alistair said mildly as we entered the room, then added, "Close and lock the door, please." Dominic did as he asked without argument, and I raised an eyebrow at him in question before turning and heading for the sofa. "Now that we're all here," Alistair began, looking at Dominic and I sharply before continuing, "let us begin, shall we? Melira, your report, please." "Yes, uncle. The rats in the subterranean territories are refusing to give up information, as usual, and no one has seen anything out of the ordinary," Melira said, handing him a small notebook and returning to the sofa to sit on the arm next to me. "There has to be a way to get the rats to help," Lorenzo said, and leaned forward in his chair. "We could get their assistance if one of us could call them," Cloud said mildly. "No one in the family has rodents as their beast to call," Alistair said, and I coughed. "Do you know something we do not, Merrick? Is there someone?" he asked, and I nodded. "Four, actually. Alicia, Azuriel, Anayo, and Azurian," I said, and everyone in the room, but Dom, stared at me. "Alicia we know, the other three, though, we do not," he said, and I sighed. "All four are direct line from the Blackthorn vampire bloodline," I said. "Impossible. Everyone here knows that Leigh had no blood children," Alistair said flatly, and Dom laughed. I had known that Dominic knew the truth, just as I had known, and Cade and Ion and Mystic and Robin all knew. What I had not known was that no one else knew, and that no one who knew had told the others before this. He's right, Alistair. 3 of them, her sons, which you have met on several times, are Daoin Shi of the Unseelie court. One, Azurian, is in line to the high throne of that court. The other 2, Azuriel and Anio, are in line for the Slaw and Frost thrones, respectively. Alicia is her daughter and heir to the high throne of Celinda, the Elven High Court, Dominic said, and added, only a handful of people knew about the direct tie, Alistair. Hells, even I didn't know about it until she shared the memories of their births with me just so I could experience what it was like to have a baby. He shook his head and stared off for a moment, his eyes unfocused. Alistair opened his mouth and I raised one hand with my index finger up in a one-moment signal. His mouth closed again and he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. They are on their way. Alicia had been visiting Azuriel and will arrive with her brothers, Dom said a moment later and looked at Alistair evenly. We, Cloud and I, we also knew of One Tai, but we only knew because we saw her before she entered Ferry to go through her pregnancy and scented it, Lorenzo said, and shrugged. Though we did not know Licia was Leigh's babe as well, Cloud said, and looked at me, adding, how did you know? Leigh told me about her about 3 weeks after she was born, I said calmly. Why did she tell you? Alistair asked. We were mated, I told him, and he gaped at me for a moment. Who else, whom is male in this room besides me, did not make love to Leigh? He demanded. Silence stretched for several minutes as no one moved, and he growled out a curse. It may prove interesting to see how many of her mates she was wed to and how many of them are Fae, Dom said, and I shot him a dirty look. The damned vampire knew just what to say to cause trouble for myself and the others. How can one even tell something like that? Lorenzo asked at the room in general. The rose brands on each of her forearms, right ankle, hips, right thigh, right biceps, and throat, I said automatically, then closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose for a moment, before opening them again to glare at Dominic in aggravation. And there we have our answer, boys, Dominic said, ringing an imaginary bell. The question now is, who was she wed to? Cloud said, and looked around the room, his gaze finally settling on me. Why are we even discussing this when we need to discuss more relevant matters? I wondered and shook my head slowly. The best way to tell is to take a close look at every Fae she was in regular contact with, Lorenzo stated. You, Cloud, and several others were Leigh's mates as well, I pointed out, and asked, why focus on just those of us that are Fae? I second Uncle Merrick's question. Why just the mates that are Fae? Malera said, looking around at every male in the room and shaking her head when no one answered. You know, Mom would be pissed if she could hear you lot now. If you do not require my presence further, I will bid you good night, Uncle Alistair, she stated, and stood from the arm of the sofa. Daddy, be good, she said, stopping beside Dominic and giving him a kiss on the cheek before heading for the door. She paused in the doorway and added, Morgana and Sophie will be in before dawn, if you would like to see them, Daddy. Then left the room and closed the door behind her. If I remember correctly, Melira's mother is Minerva, and both are Kitsune, Alistair said, looking at Dom with one eyebrow raised, and then asked, why did she just call you Daddy? Because her father died in the same battle we lost Leigh in, he said, and looked up at the ceiling for a moment. But only enemies died that day, after Leigh was killed, Alistair said, and Dom nodded. True, but Melira's father and Leigh were the same person, Dom said. It makes sense. Leigh could shift her sex as well as her human form, and do not forget, she had multiple beast forms. She could very well have mated Minerva, Lorenzo said. She did say once, when she was very drunk, that she had acquired female counterparts for nearly every male mate she had, Cloud said musingly, and I felt a bitter laugh bubbling in my throat. Leigh had had over 30 mates, myself included, and had nearly as many female mates as she had male. Though I had met many of her female mates, and had lived for centuries with nearly all of them in the Guildhall, not one of them was a gold lion, I thought, feeling a dull ache of loneliness in my chest. My neck started itching, and I resisted the urge to scratch the yellow rose brand on my throat under the dark blue turtleneck sweater I wore. The brand had been itching off and on for the last week, ever since the day after Aaron had been brought in, unconscious and bleeding. The itching was beginning to drive me crazy. Did Aaron need a blood transfusion? Dominic asked suddenly, his cat-green gaze fixed on me, and I wondered what had brought that question up and why he was looking at me. Why do you ask? Alistair asked curiously. She mentioned major blood loss when I asked about her injuries, and I just wondered if she had needed a transfusion, he said mildly, and leaned back on the other end of the sofa with deceptive laziness. But he was watching me intently as he waited for Alistair to answer him. I got an uneasy feeling that Dom thought something was going on with Aaron, that he suspected it had something to do with the transfusion, and that whatever he suspected was going on did not bode well for me. Or any of the others, I thought, when Dom switched his gaze to Lorenzo and Cloud. Then I noticed that, even though he had asked the question of Alistair, Dom was not looking at him at all, but rather at those of us in the room who had very intimate ties to Leigh and had been her mates. Yes, she had lost too much blood by the time I got here with her, and Nova gave her some of his, which, I might add, saved her without my having to turn her, Alistair said, and I saw Dominic tense a little before he murmured, That explains part of it. We need Isaac in here, and we need to call Leigh's other mates to the house, he said louder. Why? Alistair demanded at the same time that Lorenzo and Cloud asked. Explains what? I will explain after we get Isaac in here and call in the other mates, both the males and the females. This will have more impact on them, I believe, than it will on the rest of us, he stated, then added quietly, not to mention on her training and the mission. What do you know or suspect, Dominic? I asked. Not nearly enough, and too much, he answered vaguely, and looked toward the door. A moment later a knock sounded on the door, then a flicker of power tickled my senses, and the door lock clicked. The door opened, and Cade Blackbriar walked in, followed closely by his sister and cousin. They, in turn, were followed by Azuriel, Alicia, Azurian, and Anayo. Is there a reason you called us, Dominic? Or did you just want to see us? Azuriel asked, and leaned casually against the bookcase by the door. I don't mind, Uncle. The ball we were attending at Grand's was bloody boring, Azurian said, coming over to the sofa with Alicia and seating her between Dom and myself, before perching on the arm next to Dom. Anayo looked around for a place to sit, and not seeing one, simply levitated himself and took the lotus position in the air. I believe you have more than one reason for calling all four of us, he said, looking at Dom. Yes, I did want to see all of you, and you are correct, Anayo. I had more than one reason for calling you, Dom said, adding to Cade, and more than one reason for calling you three as well. A cloud of scentless black smoke appeared in the middle of the room in front of Rosalind as she was crossing to the sofa, and she yipped in surprise.
"What the fuck did you call me for, Alistair?" Isaac demanded as the smoke dispersed.
I did not call you, Eracilion, he said, and trailed off, glaring at Dom. May I ask why we are all here, Father? Alicia asked me, and I smiled at her. You may, but I have only one idea, and I don't think Dom would appreciate my telling you before he can explain it, I said. Thank you, Merrick. You four are here for two reasons. One, we need one of you to use your ability to call all beasts and deal with the rats to gather the information they have. Two, we seem to have an anomaly with a human that received a blood transfusion from your youngest half-brother, Nova, Dominic said, looking at each of them in turn, and silence descended on the room. It seems a simple enough job to get information from the rats. I'll do it, Azurian said decisively, and waved a hand, brushing the matter aside. Thank you, Zurian. Azuriel, since Zur has the rats in hand, I will need you to head into Inner City and do what your mother trained you to do. Watch, listen, and report back what you find. As you know, the Fae can go wherever they please, and we need that right now, Dom said. What will I be looking for? Azuriel asked, nodding. Any information about a mid-level vampire named Sarah, and anything at all about something called a walker. You'll most likely find information about both in the same location, he said. And that location would be? Azuriel asked. Go to a club called the Palace and hang around there for a few hours. Report directly to either me or Alistair via telepathy if you hear or see anything, Dom said, and he nodded sharply. Anayo, I need you and Alicia to track down Nova and bring him to my home. Nowhere else. I have a few things to ask him, and he's not answering my call, he said, and they nodded. Nodding back, he turned to Cade and eyed him for a moment before saying, I need you to accompany Azuriel and do what you do best. Sneak around and cause trouble. And I mean a lot of trouble, Cade. Not just setting a few things on fire. I'm talking total chaos here, and I need it done in a way that can't be tracked back to us. Think you can do that? I can do it without getting caught. I'll keep my eyes peeled for information as well and see what I can find out, Cade said. Good, but keep that as a secondary mission. Your primary objective is chaos, Dom said. You got it, he said, chuckling, and I could tell that he was already thinking of ways to fulfill his mission. Leigh had once told me that Cade was just one of those men who were happiest when causing problems for other people, and looking at him now, I believed her. What about us? Rosalind asked, gesturing between Rosalind and herself. Dom turned to her, a slight, evil smile on his lips and a faint glow of mischief to his eyes. I need you two to head to a place called the Zoo and be the beautiful, sexy creatures you are, and gather information from the male vampires that frequent the place, he said. You're asking us to whore ourselves out for the good of the mission? Rosalind said with glee in her voice and clapped her hands. The laugh that Dom let fall from his lips in response was deep and slightly sinister. Power laced his voice when he spoke again, and the boys froze in the act of leaving the office and crossing the room to the sofa as Anayo had been. "Before you leave, I have one more thing I would like you 3 boys to do," he said.
"What is it, Dom?"
Azuriel asked, his blue-green eyes flashing with his own power, and his fangs showed a little when he spoke. "Let your glamours down for a moment, so that Alistair will believe that you are of Leigh's line and that Merrick and I aren't lying to him," Dominic said. All 3 royal fae turned to look at Alistair with varying expressions on their faces. Azuriel sneered, Anayo looked sad, and Azarain just looked bored. All 3 then dropped their glamour, and as their true hair color and facial features were revealed, Alistair swore softly. All 3 had dark, blood-red hair, blue-green eyes, and the faintly square facial structure that Leigh had had, and not just that, but they also had her broader, more muscular body build. Lorenzo and Cloud remained silent as the grave, their eyes a little wide, and just stared at them. Isaac stared at the boys too, but the look in his yellow-orange eyes was sad and wistful. "Will I need to prove whose line I am, or will Uncle Dom's word be enough, Uncle Alistair?" Alicia asked, a trace of her mother's attitude showing through in her coldly regal tone of voice as her brothers re-established their glamours and Anayo took her hand, leading her to the door. Hurt flashed across Alistair's face and settled in his gray eyes as he looked at her. I nearly felt sorry for him, but he had brought her displeasure on himself in a way, and there was really nothing I could say in his defense. "You do not need to prove anything to me, Licia. You never have," Alistair said quietly, and looked down at his hands on the top of the desk. Alicia looked at me, and there was pain in her sea-colored eyes. "Good night, Uncle Alistair," she murmured, and let Anayo pull her out of the room behind the others. "Well, that went about as well as I predicted," Dominic said, and stood from the sofa. Alistair didn't respond, just stared at his hands and frowned. Alistair had been acting strangely ever since his talk with Aaron 2 days ago, and for the life of me I couldn't figure out what had happened between them. Aaron would not discuss it, and Alistair was pulling an amazing impression of the aloof Frenchman that he had never truly been, despite being born a French aristocrat. I was beginning to think that she had somehow hurt his feelings and truly didn't know what she had said to do it. If that was the case, then I needed to get Alistair to tell me what happened and try to fix it for them. I wasn't the only one worried about him, and all of us were trying to figure out what we could do to help. Everyone in the house knew that he was in love with her, and we all thought it was a good thing. Even Dom, though he never said anything to that effect.
"Now that Leigh's brood are gone, why the fuck was I called?" Isaac snapped, glaring at Dom and Alistair in turn.
"I called you down here to discuss something very interesting and important, Irisilion," Dom said evenly, walking around the half-demon and then stopping directly in front of him.
"Discuss what? Shit! When did the link revive?" he said, staring at Dominic in fascinated horror.
"Early yesterday evening," Dom said, and added, with a sneer on his face, "What? You did not notice it when I came here yesterday and you attacked me?"
"What link?" Alistair asked, looking up from his hands.
I felt Dom's power flicker through the room for the 2nd time tonight, and flinched as it crawled painfully along my skin.
"The telepathic blood link he had with Leigh. It's back, and I don't understand why," Isaac said.
I only vaguely heard Alistair's, Lorenzo's, and Cloud's exclamations of surprise as the yellow rose-vine brand on my throat began to itch like mad, and Dom turned to look at me just as I reached up to scratch it. He froze for a second, staring at my throat. Then he was back across the room and pulling the collar of my sweater down. When I tried to move away, his power flooded the air around me and held me in place as he examined my brand with careful intensity. After a few minutes, Dom stepped back and his power receded from holding me still. I jerked the collar back into place and glared at him. "You could have asked to look at it, Dominic," I said stiffly, and stood from the sofa to look him in the eye. I briefly glimpsed something haunted there before it was replaced by mocking amusement, and he bowed to me in a courtly fashion. "Apologies, my friend. I was just surprised to see that mark on your throat. Earlier, when I was speaking to Erin, I noticed a birthmark on her throat that looks just like it," he said, and I stared at him for a long moment, then shook my head quickly. That wasn't possible. It just was not possible for her to have the same rose brand I did as a birthmark. "You must be mistaken, Dominic. What you just said is an impossibility. There is no way that Erin and I could have matching marks. You know the laws of Fairy, and for she and I to have matching marks, we would have had to... And I've never touched her," I said, and began to truly feel panic when he shook his head slowly. "I know what I saw, Marek, and the birthmark I saw on her throat when I was checking for injuries there was an exact match to the wedded brand on yours," he said, and briefly touched his left biceps. He only touched it for a split second, but that split second was all it took for me to realize that he had been wed by Fairy, and I closed my eyes as I also realized that there had only ever been one woman around him who could have marked him like that, as he was not of Feyan blood. Opening my eyes, I looked into his again. I understood the haunted look hiding behind the mockery. There was only one way to be marked like that by Fairy: to lay with a Fae and have the female of the coupling turn up pregnant.